I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. Likelihood is your explanations aren't good enough for you to get your offer to study at Oxford or Cambridge. My name's Jamin. I studied maths at the University of Oxford, and now I help students all across the globe who are looking to get into Oxford and Cambridge get in. Now, I know a lot of you have your interviews literally in less than a week's time, or maybe some of you have it in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. But this is something that I really encourage you to do to boost your odds. Because as I say, your explanation probably sucks. Even if you think it's good, it may not be as good as you need it to be to get into these institutions. This is a little hack or a cheat or something that I actually learned after studying at Oxford. But I think if I had done this in my preparation, it would have made my life a lot easier. And this is actually a type of question that they don't ask in Oxford interviews. I mean, maybe they could in like a philosophy interview or something like that, but certainly not for maths interviews. But I still think it's very important to practice with. These are actually a certain type of problem that they'll ask you if you go to try and work in consultancy. So if you graduate and you want to go and work in consultancy, which lots of people go and do after graduating from Oxford and Cambridge, this is a style of interview question. And this is where they ask you to estimate something. So they ask you to estimate some quantity, and I'll give an example in a second. And the point of those questions is really not about getting an accurate answer. It's more so about how you get to an answer and what assumptions you make, your logical thought process behind it. And I think practicing these, A, is kind of fun, it's a bit different, but B, it's really going to force you to articulate your ideas and why you are getting, why you're following the logical steps that you are. Because again, with these problems, the answer is not the thing that's important, it's how you get to an answer. And in the interviews, it's the same. And that's sometimes a little bit difficult to fathom because we're used to, when we're solving maths problems, we're used to trying to get to the correct answer. But with the interviews, there's a much bigger, greater emphasis on how we explain and articulate our ideas. So, what is an example of an estimate problem? So this was actually asked to me in one of my interviews when I was applying for some consultancy firms. And this was, can you estimate the amount of ice cream sold in the year, I think it was like 2021 or something like that. It was a certain year. Can I estimate the volume of ice cream sold in the UK in the year 2021? Now, of course, they're not expecting you to be an ice cream expert. I don't expect you to be an ice cream expert. But you need to make some somewhat reasonable assumptions. And from that, try and get to an answer. And I think practicing these types of questions in the run-up to your Oxford and Cambridge interview, regardless if you're applying for maths. I mean, if you are applying for maths, it will definitely work. But I think it will work for any subject, just purely because it focuses so much on how you explain, communicate to the other person that this is why I'm doing the calculations I am doing. And this problem, you don't really need to write too much. Maybe you need to write a couple of numbers down, do a bit of multiplication or whatever, a bit of addition. That's about it. Nothing crazy. So it's not like you need to know calculus or anything. So this type of question is actually useful for anyone who's preparing for an Oxford or Cambridge interview, not specifically mathematicians. So let me run you through how I would answer that question. And I'll also give you the answer at the end. But it's really easy to generate these types of questions. You can just get ChatGPT to make you a bunch. I'm sure there are like fun fact estimation websites where you can estimate the number of something. And so it's just a little bit of a fun exercise. But also it's in a weird way you can kind of numerically see how far you are from the final answer, can give you a good idea of how good your estimations were. But here's how I would maybe outline my thought process here. So I'm going to imagine the interviewers just asked me how many ice creams, or what was the total volume of ice cream sold in the UK in the year 2021. I would say, okay, that's an interesting question. How many litres of ice cream was sold in the UK in 2021? And so I presume here, and so I clarify with the interviewer, I presume here we are not just taking into account things like ice cream sold in like supermarkets, but also things like restaurants, ice cream vans, maybe in like larger events and conferences, that sort of thing. And the interviewer would probably say, yes, yeah, any form of ice cream that was sold in the UK, how many litres of it was sold? Okay, so to answer this, there's maybe a few different ways I could go about approaching this. I think the first thing that springs to mind for me is working out, well, how many people there are in the UK, and then multiply that by the amount of ice cream each person eats. Now, the amount of people in the UK, that's nice and easy. I think it's around 65 million, give or take. And how much ice cream each person takes, that's going to be a little bit, each person has, sorry, that's going to be a little bit difficult because different people have different amounts of ice cream. So I think I will go down this route, but I have to be careful when calculating the amount of ice cream each person has. So I know that, for example, kids will probably eat more ice cream than maybe the average adult, just because, kids love sweet things. And I guess one thing that's also important to consider here is the time of the year as well. Like in summer, people just in general will be eating more ice cream than in the winter months because it's colder. So I guess maybe I want to split my year based off of timing as well. And I guess I may also want to consider like the average serving of ice cream, how many liters that is, and then multiply by the number of servings maybe one person has in a year, and that will give me the number of liters that an average person will have in a year. So let me take an average person. Obviously, there'll be some people who are maybe allergic to dairy and things like that and can't eat ice cream, but equally, there'll be people on the other end of the spectrum who probably eat more ice cream than they should. And so, if we kind of assume those kind of somewhat cancel out, let's take an average person. Maybe they have a scoop of ice cream, let's say once a week during the colder months. I'm not sure if that's a suitable, maybe that's a little bit too much, I'm not too sure. But let's go with it for now. A scoop of ice cream, so 4 scoops a month in the colder months. And let's just say, just to make things easy, let's say that there are 6 cold months and 6 hot months. I know we're in the UK, so I wish it was actually 6 hot months, but let's just go with 6 cold months, 6 hot months. And in the cold months, let's say we have 1 scoop, so 4 scoops of ice cream a week. So that would give me 24 overall in the cold months, roughly. Let's just say 25, because if we round up, most months have slightly more than 4 weeks in. So let's say 25 scoops in the cold months per person. And then in the warmer months, let's say we triple that. So 3 scoops on average per week in the hotter months. So we've got 3 scoops times 6 months times 4 weeks a month. 3 times 4 times 6, that's 72. So again, I'm just going to be kind here with the numbers and round that up to 75. So 25 plus 75. So if we assume that the average person has 100 scoops of ice cream per year. Now, again, that's just a rough approximation. But now all I need to do is calculate the amount of ice cream, like how much volume there is in 1 scoop of ice cream, multiply that by 100 to give me the volume of ice cream someone has in a year, and then multiply that by 65 million. So if I guesstimate, if I think about, for example, a 2-litre box of ice cream, I think maybe from that, if I was to guess, you could maybe get about 25 to 30 or so scoops. So maybe let's say 25 scoops of ice cream there from a 2-litre box. So if we have 100 scoops, that would be about 4 boxes. So 4 times 2 litres is 8 litres. And so if we assume that the average person has 8 litres of ice cream in a year, 8 litres multiplied by 65 million people in the UK is, 520 million litres of ice cream. So I would guess around 520 million. And that is how you would answer that question. And if you're curious, if I remember correctly, the answer is something like 300 million litres. So I was obviously 220 million litres off, quite a lot of litres, but in terms of an order of magnitude, I was less than a factor of 2 off. But again, it's not really about the actual number, it's really about the articulation there. And what was really important about the way that I explain it and the things that I did to explain it well is I continually kind of added in checkpoints into my explanation. So there are lots of points where I said, okay, I've calculated, let's say 100 scoops per person is the average amount of number of scoops of ice cream a person has in a year. And then what I did is I just went over what was left to do. So what was left to do is, well, to work out how much volume 100 scoops was, and then multiply that by the number of people in the UK. And so it's important that you add in checkpoints into your work just to make it easier to follow. Remember, if you're trying to explain something to someone, that's what you're doing in the interview, it's easier if they can kind of see, like every now and then, just pause and go, okay, cool, we've established all of this. Now what's left to do is just do this and we'll get to our goal. And the other thing is I didn't worry too much about the numbers. I made it very clear from the start exactly the steps the steps I was going to take to get to the final answer, which was to consider the number of people in the UK and multiply that by the amount of ice cream each person has. Now, of course, this is just one way I could approach it. Perhaps I could do this a slightly different way and think instead of like I thought about time there, like the time of year, perhaps another thing to factor is age. So maybe older people and younger people will have ice cream more because maybe the older people have a bit more time on their hands. You know, maybe watching TV, have a bowl of ice cream. And as I said earlier, kids might like ice cream, but adults, they're super busy, they don't have time for ice cream or whatever. Like, as long as the statements that you make are somewhat reasonable, uh, you know, you're gonna get you'll be surprised with how often you get to within plus or minus like within a factor of two of the actual correct answer. So I enjoy doing these problems as well. They're good fun. As I say, these are not problems that you can expect to see in the Oxford or Cambridge interview, but these are really good problems to practice your explanation skills. It's also a really fun way to, you know, make this whole process of you preparing for the interviews a little bit more enjoyable. So I'm sure there'll be lots of times where you're thinking, oh, right, I've got to do a bunch of maths problems. I don't really want to. And then you might feel a bit lonely, a bit isolated because you're stuck in your room and your family want to help but they can't. Whereas this is a little fun like game. You can turn it into a game, an exercise where you do this with your family, where they ask you a question. It's almost like a trivia quiz, whatever. But hopefully this gives you another idea of what you can be doing between now and your interview to prepare for them. And if you are preparing for maths interviews and you've never seen me before, I've made a bunch of videos, especially recently, on doing well in the maths interviews, so go and check those out. I'll leave a video on screen where I show you how to sketch a graph really, really well, which is super important for the maths interview. I'll see you over there.